Every year, millions of Americans gather around Thanksgiving dinner. It is a chance to connect with friends and family around a North American original, the turkey. The classic bird has fallen out of style in some circles, but the United States still eats roughly 46 million turkeys for Thanksgiving. These days, the majority of those birds are domestic, but the origins go back to wild turkeys of New England in the 17th century. I am, of course, talking about the famed First Thanksgiving. When the Pilgrims and Native Americans met, turkeys were abundant in New England. Historians aren't sure if turkey was included at the first Thanksgiving, but they ate some kind of wild bird. Every kid in the US learns that basic story, but what about our history with turkeys over the next 400 years? I didn't, and I'm guessing most don't. If you did, that's great, but if not, stick around and I'll tell the story of how Americans bonded together and saved wild Thanksgiving turkeys. Like the holiday itself, this story starts in New England. When Europeans landed on the eastern seaboard, New England was covered in turkeys. Most estimates say that wild turkey populations in the US were between 7 and 10 million birds in the early 1600s. It is safe to say that a lot of turkeys greeted the Mayflower. Before I continue, here are some interesting facts about turkeys. Wild turkeys are the same species as a bird you'll find in the supermarket, but that's about all they have in common. During flight, turkeys can reach speeds of up to 50 miles per hour. They look clumsy, but they are survivalist up against any large predator in the woods, including us. In the wild, males can get up to 25 pounds, and females, known as hens, will reach about 12 pounds. For comparison, a farm-raised male can be almost 40 pounds and unable to fly. Turkeys will eat everything from grain out of a field to small lizards and mice. If chickens are a modern-day velociraptor, turkeys are a larger, meaner cousin. When President Lincoln made Thanksgiving a national holiday in 1863, turkeys were almost gone from New England. By the early 1900s, they were gone across most of their native range. So what decimated turkeys over a couple of hundred years? It's simple: Americans. As Europeans and later Americans crossed North America, they chopped down habitat for cities and hunted turkeys with reckless abandon. By the Great Depression, turkeys were in serious trouble. There are some estimates that say that turkey populations were as low as 30,000 animals by 1930. To put that in perspective, Matthew Miller, the director of science communication for the Nature Conservancy, notes that turkeys in the early 1900s were as endangered as orangutans, polar bears, and African elephants are today. At the time, market hunting was a huge problem for many different species. Passenger pigeons are a famous example, but everything from mallard ducks to turkeys and bison suffered. The US was a rapidly expanding country, and these animals were an obvious source of food. Many market hunters shipped animals across state lines to large cities. One of the earliest conservation laws tried to end that practice. The Lacey Act of 1900 made it illegal to transport illegally shot game across state lines. The Lacey Act has evolved over the last century and is still active today, but I won't get into that history. The act helped end market hunting, which was a huge first step to recovering turkeys. The Great Depression and Dust Bowl were terrible for humans, but they were great for turkeys. Habitat loss slowed during that period because it wasn't profitable. When farms were abandoned and logging stopped, the eastern forest started to regrow. Programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps improved habitat throughout the turkey's range. Here in Kansas, the tree lines planted to help block the wind became core habitat for turkeys along with many other species. These improvements helped, but the conservationists putting in work on the ground were the real stars of turkey recovery. In the 1920s and 30s, hunters realized they needed to step up and conserve the wildlife we had left. They advocated for increased spending on conservation, and they were willing to fund it themselves. In 1937, the Pittman-Robertson Act was born. It taxed sporting goods like guns and bullets. That money matched state funds from hunting licenses. It is still a major source of funding for wildlife conservation today. Those funds helped kickstart efforts to recover turkeys after the Second World War. The first step towards recovery was capturing and rehoming wild birds. That presented some problems. At first, people tried to use pole traps. They were built by stacking poles on 4 sides and covering the top with netting. Food was placed at the back as bait. These traps were hard to build, and they didn't do a good job capturing enough turkeys. Eventually, cannon nets were developed. Like the name suggests, large nets were fired by cannons. Cannon nets were easy to set up and hide from the birds. They were operated remotely so a trapper could stay hidden in a nearby blind and fire them when a group of turkeys were in range. The nets allowed people to capture and transport larger groups of wild turkeys. It was the key to recovery because releasing pen-raised turkeys failed. Once the cannon nets were mastered in the 1950s, turkey recovery took off. The funding from Pittman Robertson and other sources, plus the nets, allowed state agencies to start reintroducing turkeys throughout the country. It was a wild success. In Kansas, turkeys from Oklahoma, Texas, Missouri, and Iowa were slowly captured and reintroduced to the state throughout the 1960s. The state opened its first hunting season for turkeys in 1974 with 400 permits. Now, you can get a turkey permit over the counter throughout the state. My parents grew up in Kansas during that time and don't remember seeing any turkeys until the 1980s. Matthew Miller grew up in Pennsylvania and wrote that people didn't believe him when he reported seeing a wild turkey for the first time. Today, turkeys are found from sea to shining sea. Even if you are sitting down to a domestic bird, I hope you remember the effort to recover our wild friends. Happy Thanksgiving, and if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to help grow the channel.